Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name's James Kelly, and a warm welcome back to Scott Goes Pop. 24 hours ago, I had hoped to make a video about the new full-scale Scottish poll from Survation that was on the front page of the Herald on Sunday, but alas, I couldn't because I simply couldn't find the numbers. They weren't available online at that point, but they are available now. So let's take a belated look at them. And to answer the question that I posed on the blog about would the SNP and Greens in combination be projected to be on a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, the answer to that question is yes, but only just. Um, so on the constituency ballot, the SNP are, of course, in the lead by a huge margin. They're on 34% of the vote, but that is down 3 points on the previous Survation poll. In second place, moving into second place actually, are Reform UK on 22% of the vote, which is up 4. In third place are the Labour Party on 18%, which is down 2. In fourth place, that would be the Conservatives on 10%, which is down 1. The Liberal Democrats next on 8%, which is up 1. The Greens are on 7%, which is up 2. And Alba are at a very lowly 1%, which is unchanged on the previous Survation poll. Now to the list ballot. The SNP are on 29% of the vote on the list ballot, which is down 2. In second place are Reform UK on 20%, which is again up 4. In third place are Labour on 17%, which is down 1. In fourth place, the Conservatives on 12%, which is also down 1. Then you have a tie between the Greens and the Liberal Democrats. They're both on 10%, but for the Greens, that's up 2. And for the Liberal Democrats, that's down 1. And then Alba are on 2%, which is unchanged, which is of course well below the level at which they could win any seats at all. So this is yet another poll suggesting that Alba will have 0 seats after the next Holyrood election, which of course would be unchanged now that they've lost Ash Regan, who was their only MSP. Seats projection for this poll has been worked out by Mark Diffley, and it has the SNP on 55 seats, which is 10 short of the target of 65 seats for a single party overall majority that John Swinney has artificially set as a threshold for a mandate for an independence referendum. In second place are Reform UK with 22 seats. Labour are in third place on 19 seats. The Conservatives are down to just 12 seats. The Greens have, well, actually the Liberal Democrats are next. They're on 11 and the Greens are on 10. And so that does mean that the SNP and the Greens in combination have 65 seats and the anti-independence parties have 64. So it is a pro-independence majority, which ought to be enough for the mandate, but isn't, simply because of the artificial target that John Swinney has unnecessarily imposed. One thing I found quite disturbing over the last couple of weeks is the kind of relentless hyping up we're seeing from the SNP leadership and from SNP supporters of the prospect of an SNP overall majority, which is very, very unlikely, just simply because of the way the electoral system is set up is basically specifically set up to deny parties single party majorities. It is a very, very slim chance that the SNP could win a majority, and yet it's being hyped up to the maximum, and people are starting to expect it to happen, which is just going to cause such an immense letdown in a few months, in all probability. And one thing that has not helped matters is that the Stats for Lefties account on Twitter has done its own projection of the recent Find Out Now poll and has said completely ludicrously that it would result in an SNP overall majority. I mean, other projections have the SNP several seats short of a majority on that poll, and I would have thought, if anything, even that would be an overestimate because it doesn't take into account the likelihood of unionist tactical voting in several key seats. No way on earth that Find Out Now poll would translate into a majority, and yet, of course, people are leaping on the stats for lefties projection and saying, oh, how it's really on the card. We have to motor forward now and we're going to get there. So I responded to the MSM Monitor account on Twitter. What they had said was the SNP is in majority territory because of the reform factor. Nevertheless, it can't be ignored by those who crave Indie Ref 2. Too many yesers want an indie party majority, ignoring the fact we know it leads nowhere. Both votes SNP is a chance worth taking next May. And my reply to that was, I will be voting both votes SNP because tactical voting on the list is a mug's game. But I really struggle to understand where we're going with this constant talking up the chances of an SNP overall majority that is incredibly unlikely to happen. Well, let me address my own question there because there are actually only so many possibilities here. There is the very, very small chance that the SNP overall majority will be attained. I've estimated that as a 1 in 200 chance. I think that's a reasonable estimate. But of course, it could happen. Sometimes those kind of slim chances do come to fruition. And nobody would be more delighted than I would be if that happened. And at that point, John Swinney's secret plan, the famous secret plan, would come into operation, whatever it is, and hopefully independence would follow, and that would be fantastic. On the other extreme, the pro-independence parties in combination could fall short of a majority. There could be a unionist majority, in other words. And in that circumstance, well, it's clear cut because we don't have a mandate. It's a very poor result, but at least we know where we stand. There simply isn't a mandate for independence, for a referendum, for anything. In that circumstance, we don't have a mandate, and so we know where we stand. But in the middle, and it's the middle possibility that is the most likely possibility at the moment, which is that the pro-independence parties in combination, the SNP and the Greens, do have a majority of seats between them, but the SNP on their own don't. And one thing you can be sure of is that the SNP leadership know exactly what they're going to do in that situation because they know as well as the rest of us that's the most likely outcome. And whatever it is they're planning to do, we don't know what it is, they know what it is. That will tell you what the real purpose of this strategy actually is. And to me, it seems that there are really only two logical possibilities. Because John Swinney said in his speech at the conference that, of course, a pro-independence majority should be enough. We should not need a single party overall majority. So it could be that if we get into that situation where there is a pro-independence majority but not a single party majority, he will then go back to saying, well, this should be enough, and then challenging the UK government to accept, to be Democrats, to say, this is a voluntary union, we have to accept that there is a majority in the Parliament for a referendum, and we are going to respect that. And that's what the SNP would encourage them to do and demand that they do. And that is something we could all easily get behind, I think. The other possibility, though, is what I fear and what others fear, and what actually some of the unionist admirers of this strategy have been talking up, which is the idea that Andy McKeever said this on the Holyrood Sources podcast or video, that he thought this was really about 2031 and that John Swinney knew that he was going to fall short of an overall majority. And then the plan was, well, we haven't persuaded enough people, so we have to go back to governing and to the basics, and we have to put independence on the back burner because the public have said they're not ready. Now, I don't know whether that's the plan. Only the SNP leadership themselves know whether that's the plan. But because this is a logical possibility that we can anticipate, we can be ready for that narrative to appear if this circumstance arises of a pro-independence majority without a SNP single party majority. And what we have to say is no. No, there is no problem here. There is no issue. We have the mandate. We haven't fallen short of it. It's not that people weren't ready. We have got the result we needed. We have got a pro-independence majority. The only thing that was wrong, the only mistake that was made was to set that artificial target, which we didn't need to set. The problem with this election was not the result. It was the strategy. It was the artificial target. And that's the lesson we must learn. The lesson we learn is not that we haven't done enough to persuade people and that we have to be more patient, we have to take more time. No, the lesson we've learned is we have persuaded people and we shouldn't have tied our hands behind our backs and made it impossible for ourselves by setting an impossible target. And we must ensure that never happens again. And we must pressurize within hours of the result. We must start pressurizing for that never to be repeated, an assurance that can never be repeated, and we can never uh, indulge in this sort of self-harm of setting ourselves an impossible target in an election ever again. And so we have to be ready for that moment. And, we can't do this sort of months after the election. We have to be ready to challenge the narrative within hours or within minutes of the election result becoming clear. And that's my view anyway. And that is why, incidentally, it is so important for us to work really hard to get as good an SNP result at the election as possible. Because if there is a really overwhelming or really strong pro-independence majority across the two parties, the SNP and the Greens, if, for example, the SNP gets, say, 61 seats and the Greens have another 12, so that's 73 in total, that's way, way beyond the target for a pro-independence majority, it then becomes very difficult to argue. There's a credibility gap in saying that we haven't persuaded enough people for independence or we haven't persuaded enough people of the need for a referendum. Of course, we persuaded enough people, and the only thing that was the only barrier that was there was the target, which should never have been set. That case is much easier to make with a big or a strong pro-independence majority than it would be with a very narrow one. If, for example, the SNP, as in this poll, get 55 seats, the Greens get 10, then that's a very fragile pro-independence majority, and it might be easier to make the case that, really we haven't persuaded enough people, and then that's the problem here. So that is why, whether Stu wants to hear this message or not, the logic is inescapable. We really, really need as strong a mandate for the SNP and for pro-independence parties in combination as we can possibly get. And of course, in an ideal world, that will result in an SNP overall majority. But if we fall short of that, then the next best thing is the really strong mandate that proves beyond doubt that we should never have set this target and we must never do that again. Anyway, that's it for now. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and Stu, make man a double.